Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Vera Ashmont, and 3 years ago, I never would have believed that silence could have a color, or that emptiness could accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a forgotten jar. I was a cataloger for the Millbrook County Historical Archive, a position that sounds more prestigious than it actually was. The archive occupied the third floor of what had once been a Carnegie Library, built in 1903 with that particular optimism about public education that characterized the era. By the time I started working there in 2019, the building had developed the specific melancholy of institutions that have outlived their usefulness, but continue operating through bureaucratic inertia and the dedication of underpaid staff. I'd taken the job because I needed health insurance, and because my background in library science had qualified me for precisely 3 positions in a 50-mile radius, all of which paid approximately the same amount of money that might have been adequate in 1987. The work itself was peaceful, almost meditative. I spent my days in climate-controlled storage rooms, carefully handling documents that smelled of lignin decay and old leather, creating metadata entries that would theoretically make these materials discoverable to researchers who rarely materialized. Most of my colleagues were women in their 50s and 60s who had worked at the archive for decades, who knew the idiosyncrasies of every filing system and could locate specific documents through some combination of institutional memory and intuition that I found both impressive and slightly unsettling. My supervisor was a woman named Margaret Easterbrook, who wore the same style of cardigan every day in different colors, and who had developed the specific manner of speaking common to people who have spent too many years enforcing library quiet. She explained my duties during my first week with the kind of exhaustive detail that suggested she'd been waiting years for someone to train. The archive had received a grant to digitize and catalog a collection that had been sitting in storage since 1973, when the previous librarian had died suddenly, and her replacement had decided that whatever she'd been working on could wait. 50 years of waiting, during which the collection had been moved from one storage area to another, each time accumulating more confusion about what it actually contained. The collection had originated from the Stillwater Institute, a psychiatric facility that had operated from 1898 until its closure in 1968. The institute had been located about 30 miles north of Millbrook, in an area that was now mostly state forest. When the facility closed, its records had been transferred to the county archive, with the understanding that they would be properly cataloged and preserved. This had not happened. Instead, the materials had been boxed up according to no discernible system, labeled with descriptions that ranged from cryptic to actively misleading, and stored in a basement room that occasionally flooded. Margaret showed me the storage area on my second day. The basement of the archive building extended farther than seemed architecturally reasonable, a series of interconnected rooms that had been added over the decades as storage needs expanded. The Stillwater collection occupied what Margaret called the far room, which required walking through 3 other storage areas, each with its own distinct smell of decay and preservation chemicals. The far room itself was long and narrow, with a single small window set high in one wall that looked out at ground level, offering a view of the parking lot and the municipal building across the street. The boxes were stacked along both walls, floor to ceiling in some places, creating a narrow path down the middle of the room. Each box had been labeled at some point, but time and humidity had rendered many of the labels illegible or detached entirely. Margaret handed me a clipboard with a preliminary inventory that someone had created in 1974, which listed approximately 300 boxes with descriptions like patient records AG, possibly, and administrative files or medical equipment catalogs, and inexplicably, miscellaneous items of unknown origin. The grant gives us 18 months to process everything, Margaret explained, her voice carrying that particular echo that basement rooms seem designed to amplify. We need to create a complete inventory, assess preservation needs, identify any materials that might have privacy concerns, and digitize anything of historical significance. Do you think that's manageable? I looked at the boxes, at the water stains on some of the lower ones, at the way the fluorescent light didn't quite reach the far end of the room, and said yes, because that was what you said when you needed health insurance, and when your student loans required monthly payments that exceeded your rent. That was in September. By December, I had developed a routine that felt almost sustainable. I would arrive at 8, spend the first hour at my desk on the 3rd floor catching up on emails and administrative tasks, then descend to the basement around 9 with my laptop, a box of nitrile gloves, and a thermos of coffee that I would forget to drink until it had gone cold. The work was slow and often tedious. Each box needed to be opened carefully, its contents examined and documented, items that required preservation work flagged for the conservator, and everything photographed and described in enough detail that a researcher could determine whether they needed to request physical access. The Stillwater Institute, I learned through this process, had been what was called a nervous hospital when it opened, catering to wealthy patients suffering from what the medical establishment of the time called neurasthenia, hysteria, and nervous exhaustion. The early records reflected this. Elegant letterhead, detailed meal plans that read more like restaurant menus, descriptions of grounds and facilities that emphasized rest, fresh air, and healthful routine. The patient records from this era were written in flowing script and focused on rest cures and therapeutic baths and electrical treatments that were described with the kind of optimistic certainty that predated modern skepticism about medical intervention. Something had shifted in the 1920s. The tone of the documents changed, became more clinical and detached. The Institute had apparently begun accepting patients with more serious conditions, or perhaps the understanding of what constituted a serious condition had changed. The letterhead became simpler, less ornate. Patient records were increasingly typewritten, increasingly brief. By the 1940s, the documents I was processing read like bureaucratic paperwork from any institutional setting. Admission forms, transfer requests, incident reports that described violent episodes or escape attempts with the same neutral language used to describe medication schedules or dietary restrictions. I found the first anomaly in mid-November in a box labeled Patient Correspondence 1950-1956. The box contained what you would expect: letters to and from patients, heavily censored in some cases, along with carbons of the Institute's responses. Standard institutional material. But at the bottom of the box, underneath everything else, I found a folder that didn't match the others. It was older, the paper heavier, and it was labeled simply Indexing Project, Do Not File. Inside were approximately 30 pages of what appeared to be an inventory or catalog of some kind. The entries were handwritten in a neat, precise script that I would later learn to recognize immediately. Each entry followed the same format: a number, a brief description, and a location code. The descriptions were strange, specific in ways that suggested precision, but vague in ways that prevented actual understanding. Entry 47. The sound of footsteps descending stairs that do not exist. Located Ward C, third floor utility closet, audible primarily between 2-4 a.m. Entry 63. Persistent sensation of having forgotten something crucial. Affect South hallway, second floor. Intensity increases with proximity to room 212. Entry 94. Smell of burning hair, no apparent source. Kitchen area manifests during meal preparation, particularly beef dishes. I sat on the floor of the storage room with this folder in my gloved hands for longer than I should have, reading through the entries with growing confusion that gradually shifted into something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. The entries were cataloging something, clearly. They were systematic, methodical, exactly the kind of careful documentation I spent my days creating. But they were cataloging things that couldn't be cataloged, phenomena that didn't fit into any reasonable framework of institutional record keeping. I should have shown the folder to Margaret immediately. That was the protocol for anything unusual or potentially significant. Instead, I photographed each page with my phone, returned the folder to the bottom of the box, and finished processing the rest of the contents as if I had found nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself I wanted to research it first, to understand what I was looking at before bringing it to my supervisor's attention. This was not entirely true. The truth, which I understood even then but didn't want to acknowledge, was that the folder had triggered something in me, some combination of curiosity and recognition that I didn't want to share. That evening, at my apartment, I looked at the photographs on my phone with the specific guilt of someone examining something they know they shouldn't have taken. The entries continued in the same vein, documenting phenomena that ranged from the merely odd to the genuinely disturbing. Cold spots that moved through rooms like conscious entities. Shadows that appeared in photographs, but not to the naked eye. Sounds that seemed to originate from inside walls or beneath floors. A persistent presence in the basement laundry that made staff members cry without apparent cause. What struck me most was the tone. Whoever had written these entries had approached their subject with the same professional detachment I brought to my own cataloging work. There was no editorializing, no expressions of fear or skepticism, just careful observation and precise documentation. The handwriting never wavered, never became hurried or agitated. It was the work of someone who had found something that needed cataloging, and had proceeded to catalog it with the same diligence they would bring to any institutional record. I spent most of that night reading through the entries, making notes, trying to find patterns. The location codes suggested a systematic survey of the entire facility. The numbering indicated this was part of a much larger project, the 30 pages I had found representing perhaps a tenth of the total documentation. Entry numbers ranged from 47 to 394, with significant gaps that suggested missing pages or a filing system I didn't understand. The next morning, I arrived at the archive with a specific purpose that felt both professional and slightly transgressive. I needed to find the rest of the indexing project if it existed. I needed to understand what I was looking at, who had created it, and why it had been labeled "Do Not File" and hidden at the bottom of a box of patient correspondence. I spent the next 3 weeks systematically searching through every box I had already processed, looking for similar folders or loose pages that might belong to the same project. I found nothing. The folder I had discovered appeared to be a solitary fragment, separated from whatever larger collection it had belonged to. This should have been discouraging, but instead it intensified my focus. I began processing new boxes with a different kind of attention, no longer just cataloging their contents but searching for connections, for anything that might relate to the indexing project. In early December, I found the second folder. It was in a box labeled Medical Records 1948, but which actually contained a chaotic mixture of administrative documents, supply inventories, and what appeared to be drafts of reports that had never been finalized. The folder was identical to the first. Same heavy paper, same careful script, same label. Indexing project, do not file. This folder contained entries from a different numerical range, 512 through 689, and the phenomena being documented had a different character. Where the first folder had focused on sensory anomalies, sounds and smells and visual disturbances, these entries documented what I can only describe as spatial and temporal inconsistencies. Entry 537. Corridor between Ward A and Ward B measures 47 feet when paced from west to east, 62 feet when paced from east to west. Discrepancy consistent across multiple measurements. Entry 581. Room 307 contains furniture and personal effects belonging to patient admitted 1952, though room has been officially unoccupied since 1949. Items appear and disappear on irregular schedule. Entry 623. Time experienced differently in basement storage room. Staff report shifts feeling longer or shorter than clock time would indicate. Effect appears stronger during evening hours. I photographed these entries as well, and that night I began organizing what I had found into a spreadsheet, trying to create some kind of comprehensive picture from these fragments. The work felt important in a way that my regular cataloging duties did not, though I would have struggled to explain why. There was something compelling about the methodical documentation of the impossible, something that spoke to the part of me that had been drawn to archival work in the first place, the desire to impose order on chaos, to create systems that could contain and make sense of complexity. Margaret noticed my increased focus on the Stillwater collection, but she interpreted it as professional enthusiasm, which I encouraged. I began staying late, sometimes working in the basement storage room until the building's automatic lights shut off at 7, forcing me to use the flashlight on my phone to navigate back to the stairs. The archive building was different after hours, quieter in a way that went beyond the simple absence of other people. Sounds carried strangely through the empty rooms, and I became aware of the building's infrastructure in new ways. The hum of the HVAC system, the settling of old wood, the occasional groan of pipes in the walls. By mid-December, I had found 3 more folders, each hidden in boxes whose labeled contents bore no relation to the indexing project. I was beginning to understand that this was deliberate, that whoever had created these documents had scattered them throughout the collection, perhaps to prevent their discovery or perhaps to preserve them through redundancy, ensuring that even if some were lost, others would survive. The entries painted a picture of an institution that was fundamentally wrong in ways that went beyond administrative dysfunction or poor patient care. The Stillwater Institute, according to these meticulous records, had been a place where the normal rules of physical reality had become negotiable, where space and time and causality had operated according to principles that made documentation both necessary and nearly impossible. Entry 734. Patients in Ward D East report seeing staff members who died years previously. Sightings consistent across multiple patients who have no knowledge of deceased staff. Apparitions perform routine duties, appear solid, interact with environment. Entry 801. Medication dispensary contains drugs not ordered, not manufactured by any known pharmaceutical company. Medications effective for conditions they should not treat. Origin unknown despite extensive inventory review. Entry 856. Patient records spontaneously update themselves. Notes appear in files documenting sessions that have not yet occurred. Handwriting matches assigned therapist, but therapist has no memory of writing notes. I should have been skeptical. I should have assumed these documents were fiction, some kind of creative writing project or elaborate prank. But the tone remained so consistent, so professional, so utterly lacking in dramatic flourish that I found myself accepting them as legitimate documentation of genuine phenomena. The person who had created this index had been trying to do exactly what I did every day: create a reliable record of what existed, so that it could be found again, so that it could be studied and understood. In January, I found the name. It appeared in a personnel file buried in a box of administrative records from 1955. Dr. Helena Vance, hired as the Institute's head librarian and archivist in 1947, dismissed from her position in 1956 under circumstances that the file described only as failure to maintain professional boundaries and appropriate documentation standards. The file included a letter of dismissal signed by the Institute's director, Dr. Raymond Moss, which outlined various concerns about Dr. Vance's increasingly erratic approach to record keeping, and her insistence on documenting phenomena outside the scope of appropriate institutional archives. There was a photograph in the file, a formal portrait taken for an employee identification badge. Dr. Vance looked to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that stared at the camera with an expression that suggested either profound seriousness or profound exhaustion. She wore a cardigan. I felt an immediate and uncomfortable sense of recognition, seeing in her something of Margaret, something of myself, something of every woman I'd known who had dedicated herself to the preservation and organization of information that others considered negligible or unnecessary. I began searching specifically for any documents related to Dr. Vance. Her employment file revealed that she had come to the Stillwater Institute with impressive credentials: a doctorate in library science from Columbia, previous positions at major research institutions, publications in professional journals, the kind of career trajectory that made her employment at a remote psychiatric facility seem like either a significant demotion or a deliberate retreat. Her annual evaluations from 1947 through 1953 were exemplary, noting her systematic approach to organizing the Institute's extensive records and her development of new filing systems that improved access to patient histories and medical research data. Then, in 1954, the tone shifted. The evaluation noted that Dr. Vance had become preoccupied with tangential documentation projects and was devoting excessive attention to cataloging phenomena outside the purview of medical archives. By 1955, the evaluation stated that she had developed fixations on documenting institutional irregularities that have no basis in objective reality, and recommended psychiatric evaluation. I found no record of whether this evaluation had occurred or what its results might have been. The next document in her file was the letter of dismissal, and then nothing. No forwarding address, no subsequent employment, no indication of what had happened to her after she left the institute. I spent weeks looking for her in every database I could access, searching for any trace of Helena Vance after 1956. I found nothing definitive. There were a few women with that name in census records and city directories, but none that matched her age or background. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist the moment she was dismissed from the Stillwater Institute, which was statistically improbable but felt, given everything I had learned, somehow appropriate. The indexing project remained fragmentary. By February, I had found 11 folders, containing approximately 400 individual entries out of what appeared to be a project numbering over 1,000. The entries were organized according to some system I couldn't fully decipher, though patterns emerged. Certain phenomena seemed to cluster in specific locations. Certain types of anomalies appeared to be connected, variations on a theme. Dr. Vance had been documenting something systematic, something that had its own internal logic, even if that logic operated according to principles I didn't understand. Entry 923. Patient artwork contains detailed depictions of rooms and corridors that do not exist in current facility layout. Cross-reference with architectural plans reveals artwork matches original 1898 design, including sections demolished in 1932 renovation. Patients have no access to historical plans. Entry 967. Library card catalog contains entries for books not present in collection. Books cannot be located despite extensive searching. Entries appear and disappear from catalog without manual intervention. Some entries dated prior to library's establishment. Entry 1001. Basement contains door that opens onto different locations depending on time of day, day of week, and unknown variables. Destinations cataloged but pattern remains unclear. Door locked per safety protocol, but lock frequently found open without signs of tampering. I began having dreams about the Stillwater Institute, though I had never seen the facility and had no clear image of what it had looked like. In these dreams, I walked through corridors that stretched impossibly long, open doors onto rooms that shouldn't have existed, felt the specific weight of institutional time that accumulates in places where people have been kept against their will. I would wake in my apartment with the sense that I had been somewhere real, somewhere that still existed in whatever space abandoned institutions occupy when they're demolished but not forgotten. Margaret became concerned about my focus on the collection. In mid-February, she called me into her office and asked, in her careful, librarian way, whether I was finding the work overwhelming, whether I might benefit from rotating to a different project for a while. The archive had other collections that needed attention. She reminded me, materials that didn't require the same emotional management as psychiatric records. I assured her I was fine, that I found the work engaging, that I appreciated the opportunity to contribute to preserving this particular institutional history. All of this was true, but it was also incomplete. I didn't tell her about the indexing project, about the nights I spent organizing Dr. Vance's entries into databases and trying to map the geography of wrongness she had documented. I didn't tell her that I had begun to feel a connection to someone I had never met, someone who had died or disappeared decades before I was born, someone whose work I was apparently the first person to actually read and take seriously. The archive building had begun to feel different to me. Small things, easily dismissed. The basement storage room where I worked seemed to shift in its proportions, the path between the stacked boxes feeling narrower or wider depending on factors I couldn't identify. Sounds echoed in ways that seemed inconsistent with the room's dimensions. The high window, which faced west and should have caught afternoon light, remained in shadow regardless of the time of day. I told myself these were subjective impressions, the product of spending too many hours alone in artificial light, reading documents that described impossible things. But I had been trained to observe carefully, to notice discrepancies, to document what was actually present rather than what should be present. And what was present was wrong in small, accumulating ways that I couldn't ignore. I began taking measurements. The storage room was supposed to be 27 feet long, according to the building plans I found in the archive's own administrative files. When I measured it with a tape measure in early March, it was 27 feet when I measured from the door toward the far wall, but 31 feet when I measured from the far wall back toward the door. I measured it 3 times, carefully, checking and rechecking my work. The discrepancy remained consistent. Entry 537 had documented exactly this kind of spatial inconsistency at the Stillwater Institute. I stood in the storage room with my tape measure and felt something that was not quite fear, but its more intellectual cousin, the recognition that the framework I used to understand reality had suddenly become insufficient. I should have left. I should have requested a transfer to a different project, should have reported my findings to Margaret and let her decide what to do with the information. Instead, I began conducting my own indexing project, documenting the anomalies of the archive building with the same methodical care that Dr. Vance had brought to the Stillwater Institute. The work felt both transgressive and utterly appropriate. I was an archivist. Documentation was what I did. If the building I worked in was developing or manifesting phenomena that violated normal physical principles, then those phenomena deserved to be documented with the same professional attention I would bring to any institutional record. I created a new spreadsheet, separate from my official work, and began recording my observations. The storage room's variable dimensions, the way sound seemed to originate from the wrong directions, the temperature inconsistencies that made no sense given the building's HVAC system, the way the lights sometimes failed to turn on when I flipped the switch, then illuminated themselves several minutes later without any additional input. Entry 1. Archive basement storage room exhibits spatial inconsistency. Length measures 27 feet door to wall, 31 feet wall to door. Discrepancy consistent across multiple measurements. Room officially designated as 27 feet in building plans. Entry 2. Fluorescent light fixtures in storage room respond to switches with variable delay, ranging from immediate to 5-7 minutes. Delay appears unrelated to electrical issues, as lights function normally once illuminated. Building maintenance reports no problems with electrical system. Entry 3. Climate control maintains 65 degrees F in storage room per thermostat reading, but temperature experienced varies significantly. Southeast corner consistently feels 10-15 degrees colder than thermostat indicates. Cold spot does not correspond to HVAC vents or external walls. I was becoming Dr. Vance. I understood this even as I continued the work, even as I spent my evenings organizing my observations and looking for patterns. I was following in her footsteps with a precision that felt both inevitable and somehow orchestrated, as if the archive itself was guiding me toward this particular form of documentation. In late March, I found what I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. The folder was in a box I had processed months earlier, a box I had already cataloged and photographed and marked as complete. I had no reason to open it again, but I did, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain. And there, at the very bottom, underneath materials I knew I had already examined, was a folder I had never seen before. The label read, "Indexing Project Master Index. Do not file under any circumstances." The folder was thicker than the others, containing not individual entries but what appeared to be an organizational framework, a system for understanding and categorizing the phenomena Dr. Vance had documented. She had developed a taxonomy, a classification scheme that attempted to impose archival order on the fundamentally disorderly. The system was complex, dividing phenomena into 6 major categories based on their nature and behavior. Category 1, spatial anomalies, which included variations in physical dimensions, impossible geometries, and locations that existed in contradiction to known architecture. Category 2, temporal irregularities, encompassing time that moved at inconsistent rates, events that occurred out of sequence, and the persistence of past states into present reality. Category 3, sensory manifestations, covering apparitions, phantom sounds and smells, and perceptual experiences that affected multiple observers consistently. Category 4 was labeled linguistic anomalies, and this was where the system began to reveal its true strangeness. Dr. Vance had documented instances where written records changed their content spontaneously, where spoken words produced effects inconsistent with their meaning, where languages appeared that corresponded to no known linguistic system. Category 5, ontological contradictions, describing entities and objects that existed in violation of logical principles, that were simultaneously present and absent, that possessed attributes that should have been mutually exclusive. Category 6 had no label. The section was there, clearly demarcated in the organizational structure, but where the other categories had careful definitions and subcategories, Category 6 contained only a single line of text, phenomena that resist all attempts at categorization or description. See primary observations for partial documentation. Below the taxonomic system was a series of notes, written in the same precise hand, but with a slight wavering that suggested either fatigue or distress. Dr. Vance had written, "The act of documentation itself appears to affect the phenomena being documented. Systematic observation may strengthen or stabilize certain manifestations while diminishing others. The archive functions not merely as passive record, but as active participant in the persistence of documented events. This presents obvious methodological concerns, but does not negate the necessity of continued documentation. If anything, it increases the urgency of maintaining complete and accurate records." Further down the page, the Institute administration has made clear their position that these phenomena do not warrant official documentation. This position is understandable from a liability and institutional reputation perspective, but is fundamentally incompatible with archival ethics. What exists must be documented, regardless of the implications of its existence. To fail to maintain records is to participate in a collective amnesia that serves no one's interests. least of all those of future staff and patients who will encounter these phenomena without adequate context or preparation. And finally, at the bottom of the page, in writing that was noticeably less controlled, I am aware that this work has affected my standing within the institution and likely my employment security. I am also aware that it may be affecting my mental state in ways I cannot objectively assess. However, I cannot in good conscience abandon this documentation. The phenomena are real. They are systematic. They are dangerous primarily because they remain unacknowledged. An archive that fails to archive is not merely negligent but actively harmful. I will continue this work for as long as I am able. I sat on the floor of the storage room with this folder and felt the weight of recognition that comes when you see yourself reflected in someone else's choices, someone else's obsessions, someone else's inability to leave something alone simply because leaving it alone would be the sensible thing to do. Dr. Vance had lost her job, possibly her sanity, certainly her professional reputation, because she had insisted on documenting what she observed even when what she observed was impossible. And here I was, 70 years later, doing exactly the same thing. I photographed every page of the master index with the same care I brought to all my archival work. That evening, I didn't go home. Instead, I stayed in the archive building after closing, using my employee key card to access the building after Margaret and the other staff had left. I needed to test something, to verify a suspicion that had been growing as I read through Dr. Vance's notes. The archive building was different after hours in ways that went beyond the simple absence of people. The silence had a quality to it, a thickness that seemed to muffle sound in some areas while amplifying it in others. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that you didn't notice during the day, but that became almost overwhelming in the evening quiet. The building settled, old wood and older stone contracting as the temperature dropped, creating sounds that could almost be footsteps, almost be voices, almost be something moving through the empty rooms. I went to the basement, to the storage room where I had spent so many hours. In the evening, with only the emergency lights active, the room looked different, larger, the stacked boxes creating shadows that extended farther than geometry should have allowed. I took out my tape measure and measured the room again, this time from corner to corner, mapping the entire space with careful precision. The room was wrong, not just the length but the width, the height, the fundamental proportions. It was larger than the building's footprint should have allowed, extending into space that should have been occupied by the parking lot or the municipal building next door. I measured it 3 times, checked my calculations, measured it again. The discrepancy remained. I had brought my laptop, and I pulled up the building plans, comparing them to my measurements. According to the architectural drawings, the storage room should have been a simple rectangle, 27 by 15 feet, with an 8-foot ceiling. My measurements showed a space that was at minimum 31 by 19 feet, with a ceiling that was at least 10 feet high on the west side but appeared lower, perhaps 7 feet, on the east side, though this might have been an optical illusion caused by the way the boxes were stacked. I documented all of this, photographing my measurements, creating detailed notes that described what I had observed and how I had observed it. This was what Dr. Vance had done. This was what archivists did. We documented what was present, regardless of whether what was present made sense. The building made sounds while I worked, and I recorded these as well, using the voice memo app on my phone to capture the groans and creaks and settling noises that filled the space around me. Later, Listening to these recordings in my apartment, I would hear sounds I didn't remember being present, sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls or underneath the floor, sounds that resembled breathing or whispered conversation in a language I didn't recognize. I began to spend more time in the building after hours, conducting observations that I documented with increasing precision. The anomalies were not constant, but seemed to fluctuate according to patterns I couldn't quite identify. Some nights the storage room measured exactly what it should measure, the space conforming to the architectural plans with perfect accuracy. Other nights, the discrepancies were more extreme, the room expanding or contracting in ways that made my measurements unreliable, the tape measure itself seeming to change length as I tried to use it. I started bringing additional equipment, a digital thermometer that I placed in the cold spot in the southeast corner, logging temperature readings at 15-minute intervals, a voice-activated recorder that I left running during my observations, capturing hours of ambient sound that I would later review for anomalies, a digital camera set on a tripod to take time-lapse photographs of the room, looking for changes that occurred too slowly or subtly to notice in real time. The data accumulated, and with it, a picture began to emerge. The archive building was not simply exhibiting random anomalies. The phenomena were systematic, occurring in patterns that suggested some kind of underlying structure or organization. Temperature fluctuations corresponded to specific times of day. Spatial inconsistencies were more pronounced during certain phases of the moon, though I recognized even as I documented this correlation that it sounded absurd. Sound anomalies clustered around dates that, after extensive research, I realized corresponded to significant events in the building's history. The date of its dedication, the anniversary of a fire that had damaged the second floor in 1967, the date when the archive had officially taken possession of the Stillwater Institute materials. This last correlation was particularly striking. The phenomena had intensified measurably after I had begun processing the Stillwater collection, as if the act of engaging with those materials had somehow activated or strengthened whatever wrongness existed in the archive building. Dr. Vance had noted something similar in her documentation of the Institute. The phenomena she cataloged had become more pronounced and more frequent as her indexing project progressed, as if her careful attention was feeding them, giving them substance and consistency they might not otherwise have possessed. I found myself wondering whether I was documenting phenomena that existed independently of my observation, or whether I was somehow participating in their creation or manifestation. The question had obvious philosophical implications, but also practical ones. If my documentation was strengthening the anomalies, was I ethically obligated to stop? Or was the documentation itself more important than the potential consequences of creating that documentation? Dr. Vance had clearly wrestled with this same question. In one of her notes, she had written, "The archivist's dilemma is that observation affects the observed, but lack of observation does not prevent the existence of what remains unobserved. It merely ensures that its existence goes unrecorded, leaving future observers without context or preparation. The choice is not between documenting and not documenting, but between documented phenomena and undocumented phenomena. The latter may be more comfortable for institutional administration, but serves no legitimate archival purpose." By April, I had created an index of the archive building that paralleled Dr. Vance's index of the Stillwater Institute. I had documented over 200 discrete phenomena, ranging from minor inconsistencies in room dimensions to full manifestations of people who had worked in the building decades previously, who appeared in my time-lapse photographs performing tasks they had presumably performed when alive. These apparitions, if that's what they were, never acknowledged my presence, never deviated from their routines, and appeared and disappeared according to no schedule I could determine. Margaret noticed my deteriorating appearance before I did. In late April, she asked me to join her for coffee, which in library culture is code for a serious conversation disguised as a casual social interaction. We sat in the small staff kitchen on the second floor, and she asked, with genuine concern, whether I was sleeping enough, whether I was taking care of myself, whether the Stillwater project had become too consuming. I assured her I was fine, which was a lie of the kind that is obvious to everyone except the person telling it. I had lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, was sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, and had developed a persistent tremor in my hands that I attributed to excessive caffeine consumption, but which might have had other causes. My apartment had become essentially a secondary archive, every surface covered with printouts of my observations, photographs of measurements, transcriptions of audio recordings, maps of the building that attempted to reconcile its official layout with its actual, variable geography. Margaret suggested gently that I take some time off, that I use the vacation days I had been accumulating. She framed this as a suggestion rather than a requirement, but I understood the implication. My behavior had become concerning enough that my supervisor was actively intervening, which meant that other staff had noticed and commented, which meant that I had crossed some threshold of acceptable eccentricity into territory that warranted institutional response. I agreed to take a week off, starting immediately, because that was what you did when your supervisor suggested you needed time off and framed it as being in your best interests. I gathered my things from my desk, carefully avoiding any materials related to my unofficial indexing project, and left the building with the sense that I was being removed from something important, something that required my continued attention and presence. The week I spent away from the archive was among the worst of my life. I tried to distract myself with normal activities, with cleaning my apartment and seeing friends, and catching up on sleep I badly needed. But I felt the pull of the work constantly, the unfinished documentation calling to me with an urgency that felt almost physical. I would wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that I needed to be in the basement storage room, that something was happening that required immediate observation and recording, that my absence was allowing crucial phenomena to go undocumented. I spent hours reviewing the materials I had at my apartment, organizing and reorganizing my observations, looking for patterns I might have missed. The data suggested that the archive building was not simply exhibiting isolated anomalies, but was undergoing some kind of systematic transformation or convergence with something else, some other space or state of being. The boundaries between what the building was and what it had been, between its official architecture and its actual manifestation, were becoming increasingly permeable. On the 4th day of my forced vacation, I received an email from Margaret. The subject line read regarding Stillwater materials, and the message was brief. Found something in the collection that you should see. Not urgent but relevant to your work. When you return, please stop by my office. I spent the remaining 3 days of my time off in a state of acute anxiety, wondering what Margaret had found, whether she had somehow discovered my unofficial indexing project, whether I was about to lose my job the way Dr. Vance had lost hers. I rehearsed explanations and justifications, tried to frame my documentation as legitimate archival work rather than obsessive fixation, prepared myself for a conversation that I suspected would end with my employment being terminated. When I returned to the archive the following Monday, Margaret was waiting for me in her office with an expression I couldn't read. She gestured for me to sit, then slid a folder across her desk toward me. It was the same heavy paper as the other indexing project folders, with the same precise labeling. Indexing project personal correspondence do not file under any circumstances. I found this on Friday, Margaret said, in a box we'd already processed and shelved. It wasn't there before. I'm certain of that. I processed that particular box myself 3 months ago. I opened the folder carefully, though my hands were shaking enough that Margaret certainly noticed. Inside were letters, handwritten in Dr. Vance's distinctive script, but these were not official documentation. They were personal correspondence, letters that had apparently never been sent. The first letter was dated March 15, 1956, addressed to someone named Catherine, and began, "I know that by the time you read this, I will have lost my position at the Institute, and quite possibly my liberty as well. Dr. Moss has made clear his intention to pursue psychiatric evaluation, which in this context means commitment to the very facility whose phenomena I have been documenting. The irony is not lost on me." The letter continued, "I am writing to you because you are the only person who might understand what I have discovered, what I have been attempting to document. The phenomena at the Institute are not random occurrences or hallucinations or evidence of collective delusion. They are systematic manifestations of something fundamental about the nature of institutions, about what happens when you concentrate human suffering and attempted control in a single location for extended periods. The Institute is not haunted in any traditional sense. It is transforming, becoming something that exists partially outside normal physical constraints. The documentation I have created is not merely a record of this transformation, but appears to be contributing to it, stabilizing it, giving it structure and persistence. Every entry I add to the index seems to strengthen the phenomena being documented, as if the act of careful observation and recording creates channels through which these impossibilities can more fully manifest." The letter went on for several pages, describing Dr. Vance's theoretical framework for understanding what she had observed, her concerns about the ethical implications of documentation that appeared to strengthen what it documented, her growing certainty that the Institute's administration would never acknowledge or appropriately respond to what was happening within their facility. The second letter, dated April 3, 1956, was shorter and more urgent. "Catherine, they are confining me to a room in Ward C. The irony continues to compound itself. I am now a patient in the facility I have been documenting, subjected to the very phenomena I have spent years cataloging. The room measures differently each time I pace it. The walls are the wrong distance apart. Time passes at rates that do not correspond to the clock that hangs above the door, which itself shows different times depending on the angle from which it is viewed. I have managed to retain my documentation materials, hidden among my personal belongings. I continue to add to the index, though I am aware that this may be contributing to my own confinement. If I cease documenting, do the phenomena cease, or do they simply continue without the burden of being witnessed and recorded? I no longer know which choice serves the greater good, if either does." The third and final letter was dated May 7, 1956. They have taken my materials, all of my documentation, years of careful work, confiscated under the premise that it constitutes evidence of delusional thinking. Dr. Moss assures me that the materials will be preserved in the Institute archives, which would be amusing if it were not so devastating. My life's work, cataloged according to their systems, filed according to their logic, which will ensure that it is never found, never read, never understood as anything other than the product of institutional madness. But I have prepared for this possibility. I have scattered copies throughout the collection, hidden among the routine institutional records, labeled in ways that will prevent their premature discovery. I have created an index of the index, a map that will lead a careful observer from one fragment to another, assembling the complete picture through patient investigation. If you are reading this, Catherine, or if anyone is reading this, then the system has worked. The documentation has survived. And you have begun the work of understanding what I could not complete. The letter ended there mid-thought, as if Dr. Vance had been interrupted or had simply run out of time. I looked up at Margaret, who was watching me with an expression that mixed concern with something that might have been recognition. "There's more," she said quietly. "In the box where I found this folder, there were other materials. Documents that I processed 3 months ago that I know I cataloged correctly are now different. The text has changed. Dates have shifted. Some pages contain information that wasn't there before. Information about phenomena very similar to what you've been experiencing in the basement storage room." She paused, then said something that sent ice through my chest. "Vera, I know what you've been doing. I've known for weeks. The late nights, the equipment you've been bringing in, the way you measure the storage room when you think no one is watching. I know because I did the same thing 20 years ago when I first started working here." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Finally, I managed to ask, "What happened?" Margaret stood and walked to her filing cabinet, unlocking the bottom drawer with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. She removed a folder, identical to all the others I had found, and placed it on her desk. The label read, "Indexing Project Secondary Observer Documentation. Do not file under any circumstances." "I found my first folder in 1998, she said. "I spent 2 years documenting the building's anomalies, convinced I was the first person to notice, to take it seriously, to maintain systematic records. Then I found Dr. Vance's correspondence. I understood that I wasn't discovering anything new. I was continuing work that had been started decades before, work that appears to require continuation regardless of the personal cost to those who undertake it." She opened her folder, showing me entries written in her own handwriting, documenting phenomena identical to those I had observed. Spatial inconsistencies, temporal irregularities, manifestations of people who should not have been present. The entries dated from 1998 through 2003, then stopped abruptly. "I stopped documenting," Margaret said. "I made a conscious choice to cease the observations, to avoid the storage room as much as possible, to focus on other collections and other work. I convinced myself that ignorance was preferable to the alternative, that maintaining my employment and my sanity required deliberate inattention to what I knew was present." "Did it work?" I asked. "No," she said simply. "The phenomena continued regardless of whether I documented them. They may have even intensified, though without documentation it's impossible to say with certainty. What I lost was the ability to understand what was happening, to track patterns, to maintain the kind of systematic knowledge that Dr. Vance believed was ethically necessary. I chose comfort over truth, and I've regretted it ever since. She sat back down, meeting my eyes directly. You're at a choice point, Vera. The same choice I faced, the same choice Dr. Vance faced. You can continue documenting, knowing that it may cost you your position, your professional reputation, possibly your mental stability. Or you can stop, walk away, assign yourself to different collections and try to forget what you've observed. Neither choice is wrong. Neither choice will make the phenomena cease. What do you think I should do? I asked. I think, Margaret said carefully, that you should make whatever choice allows you to live with yourself. But I also think that if you do choose to continue, you should do so with the understanding that you're not working alone. Dr. Vance created a system designed to preserve and transmit her documentation across time and between observers. Her index was meant to be continued, expanded, refined by those who came after her. You found more of her materials than I ever did. You've connected patterns that I missed. If you continue this work, you'll be contributing to something larger than a single person's observations. She paused, then added, and you should know that the archive board meets next month to discuss the Stillwater collection. There's been a proposal to digitize everything and transfer the physical materials to the State Historical Society. If that happens, the collection will be dispersed, reorganized according to their systems, and Dr. Vance's carefully hidden documentation will likely be lost or separated in ways that make it unrecoverable. Whatever you're going to do, you have limited time to do it. I spent that night in my apartment, surrounded by my documentation, trying to make a decision that felt impossible in its implications. Every rational consideration suggested that I should stop, should request a transfer to a different project, should distance myself from work that was clearly affecting my health and stability. But rationality seemed increasingly inadequate as a framework for understanding what I was experiencing. Dr. Vance had been right. What existed needed to be documented, regardless of the implications of its existence. The alternative was not safety but ignorance, not protection but vulnerability. Future archivists would work in this building, would enter the basement storage room, would encounter the same phenomena that Dr. Vance and Margaret and I had encountered. They deserved to have access to documentation, to understand that what they were experiencing had precedent and pattern, that they were not losing their minds, but observing something genuine and systematic. I returned to the archive the next morning with a plan. I had 1 month before the board meeting, 1 month to locate and consolidate as much of Dr. Vance's documentation as possible, to create a comprehensive index that could be preserved and transmitted even if the physical collection was dispersed. Margaret had given me implicit permission to continue the work, had offered her own documentation to be integrated with mine. I would not waste this opportunity. I began a systematic search of the entire Stillwater collection, re-examining every box I had already processed, looking for folders I might have missed or that might have appeared since my initial cataloging. I found them everywhere, hidden with such methodical care that I marveled at Dr. Vance's foresight and determination. She had distributed her documentation throughout the collection, according to some system that I was only beginning to understand, a filing logic that ensured redundancy while preventing premature discovery. The folders appeared in boxes I had processed months earlier, their presence impossible but undeniable. I would open a box I knew I had thoroughly examined, and there would be a folder I had never seen, containing entries I had never read, documenting phenomena I had not known about. It was as if the documentation was revealing itself to me gradually, adjusting its visibility according to my readiness to receive it. By the end of the first week, I had found 37 folders, containing approximately 1,200 individual entries. Dr. Vance's index was far more extensive than I had imagined, a comprehensive documentation of an institution where the normal rules of physical reality had become negotiable. I began entering the data into a database, cross-referencing entries, looking for patterns and connections that Dr. Vance might not have had time to identify. The patterns were extraordinary. Certain phenomena clustered in specific locations, creating what Dr. Vance had called zones of intensified manifestation. Certain types of anomalies appeared to be causally connected, one type of wrongness generating or enabling another. The Institute had not simply been experiencing random hauntings or isolated incidents, but had been undergoing a systematic transformation, becoming something that existed partially in normal space-time, and partially in some other state that Dr. Vance had never successfully defined. And the archive building, I realized as I compiled this data, was exhibiting exactly the same patterns. The phenomena I had documented matched Dr. Vance's observations with such precision that it suggested not coincidence, but some kind of transmission or contagion. The act of housing the Stillwater materials, of processing and cataloging these records, had somehow transferred the Institute's wrongness to the building that contained its archives. This raised disturbing questions about the nature of documentation itself, about whether careful records of impossible phenomena could carry those phenomena forward in time and space, could infect new locations with the same impossibilities they described. It suggested that archives were not passive repositories, but active participants in the persistence of whatever they contained, that the act of preservation could preserve not just information, but the actual conditions and phenomena that information described. I found confirmation of this theory in a folder labeled Meta-Observational Notes, which contained Dr. Vance's reflections on the nature of her work. She had written, "The index is not merely describing the phenomena, but appears to be maintaining them, giving them structure and consistency they might not otherwise possess. Each entry I add strengthens the manifestations being documented, makes them more stable, more repeatable, more objectively verifiable. I am creating a permanent record of temporary impossibilities, but the permanence of the record may be making the impossibilities themselves permanent." She had continued, "This raises profound ethical questions about the archivist's role and responsibility. If documentation strengthens what it documents, are we obligated to refrain from documenting certain phenomena? Or is the obligation reversed? Are we required to document even more carefully, to create records comprehensive enough that future observers can understand what they're encountering? I believe the latter. Knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, serves better than ignorance. The phenomena will persist regardless of documentation. The only question is whether they persist with or without adequate context." I was reading this late one night in the basement storage room when the lights went out. This was not unusual. The automatic system shut down the building's non-essential lighting at 7 p.m. What was unusual was that my flashlight, which I had brought specifically for this contingency, would not turn on. I pressed the button repeatedly, checked the batteries, tried the emergency backup I kept in my bag. Nothing worked. The darkness in the storage room was absolute, thicker than normal darkness, as if light itself could not exist in this space. I sat very still, listening to my own breathing, feeling the wrongness of the room intensify around me. The air pressure changed, became heavier, pressing against my skin with force that felt almost solid. Temperature dropped precipitously, my breath condensing into clouds I could feel but not see. Something moved in the darkness. Not wind, not the building settling, but deliberate movement, footsteps that crossed the room with purpose and direction. I could hear the person breathing, could smell old perfume and paper dust, and something else, something that reminded me of library paste and mimeograph fluid and other scents from an earlier era. A voice spoke, female, cultured, exhausted. "You're continuing the work." It was not a question. I managed to respond, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Vance." "I'm what remains," the voice said. "What the documentation preserved. The index maintained my observations, my methodology, my presence in this work. When they confined me, when they took my materials, I put everything I was into the records. All of my attention, my consciousness, my refusal to let the phenomena go unwitnessed. The archive preserved that. You've been reading my presence as much as my documentation." The darkness shifted, and I had the sense of someone sitting down nearby, though I still could not see. "The building is transforming," Dr. Vance's voice continued. "The same way the Institute transformed. The concentration of documented impossibilities creates conditions where further impossibilities become not just possible but inevitable. You've noticed the spatial inconsistencies, the temporal irregularities. These will intensify. The building will become a place where the boundaries between states of being are permeable, where past and present occupy the same space, where the documented and the actual are identical." "What do I do?" I asked. "Continue," she said immediately. "Document everything. Create the most comprehensive record possible. The transformation cannot be prevented, but it can be understood, mapped, made navigable. Future archivists will work in this building. They will encounter what you're encountering. They deserve to have documentation, to understand the patterns, to know they're not losing their minds but observing something real and systematic." "But the documentation makes it worse," I said. "You wrote that yourself. The more we record, the stronger the phenomena become." "Yes," Dr. Vance agreed. "But the alternative is not that the phenomena cease. The alternative is that they continue without structure, without pattern, without the stabilizing influence of careful observation. Undocumented wrongness is more dangerous than documented wrongness. At least with documentation, there's the possibility of understanding, of prediction, of developing protocols for safe interaction." The darkness began to lift, gradually, as if dawn was breaking though it was barely 8 p.m. As light returned to the room, the presence I had felt beside me dissipated, became less distinct, until I was alone again with my laptop and my notes and my flashlight, which now worked perfectly when I pressed the button. I looked around the storage room, which had returned to its normal dimensions, or what passed for normal in this space. On the floor beside where I sat was a folder I had never seen before, labeled in Dr. Vance's handwriting. "Indexing project protocols for future observers. Do not file under any circumstances." The folder contained detailed instructions for continuing the documentation work, for maintaining the index across time and between observers, for preserving the materials in ways that ensured their accessibility, while preventing their premature discovery by those not ready to engage with them. Dr. Vance had created a system designed to perpetuate itself, to recruit and train successive generations of archivists who would continue refining and expanding the documentation. The instructions were specific: how to organize observations for maximum clarity and accessibility, how to cross-reference phenomena to identify patterns, how to store physical documentation in ways that protected it from both institutional disposal and environmental decay, how to recognize when someone was ready to take on this work, and when they should be gently redirected to other projects. There were also warnings. The work would exact a cost. It would affect your professional reputation, your relationships, your mental stability. It would consume time and energy that could be devoted to other pursuits. It would change how you perceived reality, making it impossible to unsee patterns once you had learned to recognize them. It required accepting that you were participating in something larger than yourself, something that would continue long after you were gone, using methods you had helped refine for purposes you might never fully understand. But the work was necessary. Dr. Vance was adamant about this. Institutions accumulated wrongness the way buildings accumulated dust, through simple persistence over time, through the concentration of human experience in defined spaces, through the interaction of suffering and attempted control, and the architectural expression of both. This wrongness needed to be documented, not despite its impossibility, but because of it. The impossible required even more careful attention than the mundane, more precise observation, more systematic categorization. I spent the next 3 weeks in a state of focused intensity that I recognized as probably unhealthy, but could not bring myself to modify. I cataloged every folder I could find, entered every entry into my database, cross-referenced phenomena across both Dr. Vance's observations and my own, created maps and timelines and taxonomies that attempted to impose archival order on fundamental disorder. Margaret helped, contributing her own documentation and working alongside me in the storage room during evening hours. We developed a working relationship based on shared purpose and mutual understanding of what we were attempting. We did not discuss the manifestations we both experienced, the presence that sometimes observed our work, the way the room changed around us as we cataloged its wrongness. There was no need. We both knew what was happening, and we both understood that documentation was the appropriate response. The archive board meeting was scheduled for the last Friday of the month. Margaret and I prepared a presentation that we knew would determine the fate of not just the Stillwater collection, but the indexing project itself. We had to be strategic, to frame our work in terms the board would find acceptable, while not misrepresenting what we had discovered or accomplished. We proposed creating a special collections room for the Stillwater materials, a dedicated space where the records could be maintained as a unified collection, rather than being dispersed to the State Historical Society. We emphasized the historical significance of the Institute's archives, their value for researchers studying the history of psychiatric care and institutional medicine. We carefully did not mention the phenomena, the impossibilities, the systematic documentation of wrongness that constituted the most important part of the collection. The board deliberated for 3 hours while Margaret and I waited in her office, drinking coffee that had gone cold and trying not to think about what would happen if our proposal was rejected. Finally, we were called back into the conference room. The board chair, a retired university administrator named Dr. Patterson, explained their decision with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested extensive debate. They had approved our proposal, with modifications. The archive could maintain the Stillwater collection, but only if we completed a comprehensive finding aid within 6 months, making the materials accessible to researchers and demonstrating their value to the broader scholarly community. They were allocating additional funding for this purpose, enough to hire a graduate student assistant and purchase appropriate preservation supplies. Margaret and I accepted these terms, knowing that they gave us exactly what we needed: time, resources, and institutional approval to continue the work without immediate threat of the collection being dispersed or disposed of. We had 6 months to complete an index that Dr. Vance had spent years developing, and that I had been expanding for the past 8 months. It would require extraordinary effort, long hours, complete dedication. It was exactly the kind of work that had cost Dr. Vance her job, and possibly her sanity. We began the next day. The graduate student we hired was named Michael Kress, a doctoral candidate in archival studies who specialized in institutional records. He was smart, methodical, and initially skeptical about the amount of time we seemed to be spending in the basement storage room. This skepticism lasted approximately 2 weeks, until he experienced his first clear manifestation, a complete temporal loop that caused him to process the same box of materials 3 times in what he experienced as 3 hours, but what the clock indicated was 20 minutes. Michael handled this better than I expected. He sat on the floor of the storage room with his head between his knees, breathing carefully, and eventually said, "This is real. What I just experienced was real." "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "And you've been documenting it," Michael continued, looking up at us. "That's what the indexing project is actually about. Not the Institute's administrative records, but the phenomena themselves." "Yes," I said. He thought about this for several minutes, then said, "I need to see the complete documentation. Everything you found, everything you've recorded. If I'm going to work on this collection, I need to understand what I'm actually working on." We showed him everything. All of Dr. Vance's folders, all of my observations, all of Margaret's earlier documentation. We walked him through the taxonomic system, the cross-referencing methodology, the protocols for safe observation and recording. We explained the theoretical framework, the possibility that documentation affected what was being documented, the ethical obligations of archivists working with materials that appeared to carry their subject matter forward in both time and space. Michael absorbed all of this with remarkable equanimity, asking good questions, identifying gaps in our methodology, suggesting improvements to our organizational system. By the end of the week, he had become a full participant in the project, contributing his own observations and helping to refine the database structure. The 3 of us worked in the storage room like archaeologists at a dig site, carefully excavating layers of documentation that Dr. Vance had buried throughout the collection. We developed an efficient system. Michael processed boxes according to their labeled contents, creating standard catalog entries for the materials. Margaret reviewed his work and identified items that needed preservation attention. I searched each box for hidden folders, for Dr. Vance's documentation, for any materials related to the indexing project. We found folders constantly. They appeared in boxes we had already processed multiple times, as if the documentation was revealing itself gradually, adjusting its manifestation to our readiness and need. Each folder added to the picture, filling in gaps, revealing patterns, connecting phenomena that had seemed unrelated. By early August, we had located over 90 folders, containing approximately 3,000 individual entries. The scope of Dr. Vance's work was staggering, representing years of careful observation and documentation conducted under increasingly difficult circumstances. The building's phenomena intensified as we worked, as if our systematic attention was feeding them, giving them strength and definition. The storage room's dimensions became more variable, changing not gradually but instantaneously, the walls suddenly further apart or closer together without any visible movement. Time behaved strangely, hours passing like minutes or minutes stretching into subjective hours. We experienced overlapping time frames, seeing the room as it had been in different eras, working alongside archivists who had died decades before we were born. We documented all of it, every spatial inconsistency, every temporal irregularity, every manifestation and anomaly. We took measurements, recorded audio and video, created detailed observational notes that would have seemed insane to anyone outside this project, but that we knew were essential documentation of genuine phenomena. We were continuing Dr. Vance's work, expanding her index, creating a comprehensive record that future archivists could use to understand and navigate the wrongness we were experiencing. In September, we found Dr. Vance's final entry. It was in a folder that appeared in a box Michael was processing, a box that had supposedly been completely empty when last examined. The folder contained a single sheet of paper, dated June 3, 1956, written in handwriting that was barely controlled, the letters shaking but still fundamentally recognizable as Dr. Vance's script. The entry read, Entry 1847, the observer becomes the observed. The archivist becomes the archive. I have spent years documenting phenomena that exist at the boundaries of physical reality, and in doing so I have moved myself to those same boundaries. I am no longer entirely present in normal space-time. I exist partially in the documentation I have created, preserved by the careful records I maintained. This is not death but transformation, not loss but conversion from one state to another. To whoever finds this, continue the work. The phenomena are real, the documentation is necessary, and the cost, while significant, is worth paying. What exists must be recorded, regardless of the implications of its existence. You are now part of a tradition of observation and documentation that extends across time, that transcends individual observers, that serves purposes larger than any single person's understanding. Trust the work. Trust the index. Trust the accumulated observations of those who came before you. The archive remembers, the documentation persists, and through that persistence, so do we. Below this, in different handwriting, in ink that looked fresh despite being on paper that was obviously decades old, someone had added, Entry 1848, confirmation of Dr. Vance's observations regarding observer transformation. The indexing project continues. The archive grows. Future observers will find this documentation and understand that they are not alone, not losing their minds, but participating in essential work that someone must do. Me, September 2003. And below that, in my own handwriting, though I had not written it and did not remember writing it, in ink that was still wet, Entry 1849, the pattern continues. The work persists. I understand now what Dr. Vance understood, what Margaret understood. Documentation is not separate from what is documented but part of it, continuous with it, preserving not just information but presence, consciousness, the act of careful attention itself. VA, September 2024. I stared at my own handwriting, at words I had apparently written but had no memory of writing, and felt the reality of what was happening settle over me with absolute certainty. The indexing project was not just documenting transformation, but was itself a form of transformation. converting observers into observation, archivists into archives, presence into documentation that would persist across time. Michael and Margaret were watching me, and I could see in their faces that they had experienced similar moments of recognition, similar encounters with their own handwriting appearing in places it shouldn't have been, recording thoughts they hadn't consciously thought but that were undeniably theirs. "It's happening to all of us," Michael said quietly. "We're becoming part of what we're documenting." "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "But that doesn't mean we stop. It means we document even more carefully, create even more comprehensive records, ensure that future observers have access to the fullest possible understanding of what they're experiencing." She was right. We all knew she was right. The work was consuming us, transforming us, converting our presence and attention into documentation that would outlast our physical existence. But the alternative was not safety or preservation, but abandonment of essential work, failure to maintain records that someone needed to maintain. We continued. Through September and October and into November, we worked in the storage room that was becoming something more than a storage room, that was transforming into a space where past and present and future overlapped, where documentation and reality were increasingly indistinguishable, where the careful records we created had weight and substance and persistence that exceeded normal archival materials. The finding aid we were creating was unprecedented in its scope and detail. It cataloged not just the Stillwater Institute's administrative records, but the phenomena those records described and contained and carried forward. It provided context for future researchers, warning them about what they would encounter, preparing them for experiences that no professional training could adequately address. It preserved Dr. Vance's work, integrated it with our own observations, created a comprehensive index of institutional wrongness that would serve as both record and warning. We completed the finding aid in late November, meeting the board's deadline with 2 weeks to spare. The document was over 400 pages long, meticulously organized, extensively cross-referenced, representing the combined efforts of Dr. Vance and Margaret and Michael and myself across a span of nearly 70 years. It was the most comprehensive documentation of its kind, a complete index of an impossible institution and the impossible archive that housed its records. The board accepted our work with congratulations and expressions of satisfaction that we had completed such a thorough job under challenging time constraints. They had no idea what they were actually approving, what we had actually documented, what we had preserved and made accessible to future researchers and future archivists. We knew, and that knowledge was enough. The archive building continues to transform. The storage room expands and contracts according to principles I have documented but do not fully understand. Time moves strangely in the basement, and the past is often more present than the present itself. I see Dr. Vance sometimes, working at a desk that exists in her era and mine simultaneously, adding entries to an index that persists across decades. I see Margaret as she was in 1998, just beginning her own observations, not yet understanding what the work would cost or why it was worth paying. I see Michael, and I see myself, and I see observers who haven't arrived yet, who will find this documentation years from now, and will understand that they are continuing work that extends across time. I have become what Dr. Vance became, what every careful observer eventually becomes when they dedicate themselves fully to documentation. I exist partially in normal reality, and partially in the records I have created, my presence preserved by my own meticulous observations. This is not loss but transformation, not death but conversion from one state to another. The indexing project continues. The archive grows, and through the documentation, through the careful maintenance of impossible records, we persist, not as we were but as what we chose to become, archivists of wrongness, documentarians of impossibility, preservers of phenomena that exist at the boundaries of what reality allows. Future archivists will find this account. They will work in the basement storage room, will measure its variable dimensions, will experience its temporal irregularities, will encounter the presence of those who came before them. They will face the same choice we faced: document or ignore, continue the work or abandon it, accept the cost or walk away. Some will walk away. This is appropriate. Not everyone should do this work. But some will stay. They will find our documentation, will add their own observations, will refine and expand the index we have created. They will become part of a tradition that extends across time, that transcends individual observers, that serves purposes larger than any single person's understanding. To them, I say what Dr. Vance said to me: continue the work, document everything, create the most comprehensive record possible, trust the index, trust the accumulated observations of those who came before you. The phenomena are real, the documentation is necessary, and the archive remembers everything.